I'm Joshua Shirley with the Fresno chapter of Veterans for Peace, and I want to thank our co-sponsors. We've got Peace Fresno, and the Fresno Center for Nonviolence, and the Fresno branch of WILF, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. To kick us off in the spirit of Armistice Day, which is a 100-year-old commemoration of the end of the war to end all wars, 1918, it was a day of peace. It was a day to honor the fallen. In that spirit, in that vein of peace, we're going to have a few little musical performance by the Raging Grannies.
As you can tell, we are the Raging Grannies, and we're going to sing 2 songs for you, and then the third one we expect you to join in with us. It will be Let There Be Peace on Earth, and we will ask you to stand and hold hands and sing along with us. But first of all, we rage to end all wars.
We are the Raging Grannies, and we want you all to know that war is not the way to peace, and we must all say no. We've seen it time and time again, war's not the way to go. We rage to end all wars. No more militarization. We are raging at our nation. And those who say they'll end it, and they do it more and more. We rage to end all wars. We put away our knitting, put the grandkids into bed, throw our shawls and aprons, put our hats upon our heads. We could be baking bread, but we are in the streets instead. We rage to end all wars. No more militarization. We are raging at our nation for spending all our taxes to destroy, exploit, and kill. We rage to end all wars. We rage to end all wars.
Some of you probably know this song too, and if so, sing along. Last night I had the strangest dream.
And talent in singing is not a requirement, as you might notice from us.
Last night I had the strangest dream I'd ever dreamed before. I dreamed the world had all agreed to put an end to war.
That's good.
Yeah, that was wonderful. Big round of applause for the Raging Grannies. So that might seem like an unusual thing to kick off a day like today when we're honoring November 11th, which most of us know as Veterans Day. But if you know the actual history of the November 11th holiday, you know it actually was a day of peace. It was a day of the spirit of never again. The war to end all wars was called to a truce on the 11th hour, the 11th day of the 11th month in 1918. And for generations, people gathered at churches and rang the church bells 11 times with the idea that peace would reign, that war would be abolished as an instrument of national policy. Well, obviously that didn't work out too well. Here we are a century later, and all too often we find ourselves in conflicts around the globe, not to mention the conflicts within our own society here at home. So that's one of the things that Veterans for Peace tries to call attention to expose the true costs of war, not just the financial costs, but the human costs, the moral costs, and to build a culture of peace, to use our platform as veterans to hopefully say of war never again, and of course to abolish war as an instrument of national policy. So what we did today was invite a guest speaker, Mitch Jeserich from Pacifica Radio. He's going to come out and talk to us a little bit. Not really sure what Mitch is going to talk about, but he is the host of Letters in Politics on KPFA. And Mitch is very skilled at talking about history and then also, sort of relating that to today, making those connections to the things that are important. So, just a few housekeeping notes. I hope we'll have our cell phones on silent. Mitch will talk for about 45 minutes or so. We'll try to do some Q&A for about 10 or 15 minutes, and then wrap it up. So without further ado, Mitch Jeserich.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me okay? You want it louder? Louder?
Choke up on the mic, Mitch.
Choke up on the mic, Mitch. Is that like some hip-hop song or something? I don't think it goes up any higher. Can you hear me now? Yes. Oh, it'll just be like this the whole time. Soon you'll be sorry that we're not singing songs anymore. I wish we were singing songs still. That was lovely. To follow the Raging Grannies like that. Thank you for that. I really enjoyed that. And well, thank you for having me here to participate in this event to mark 100 years since the end of World War I. After much reflection, I believe that World War I has basically led to everything that came after it. The 20th century, brought to you by the Great War. Of course, they called it the Great War back in the day. When Gary asked me to come speak today, I have to say I actually didn't know a lot about this whole issue of rebranding Armistice Day to Veterans Day back in 1954. And so I had to study up a little bit on it. What's going on here? And after much reflection, I would have to say that it very much makes sense to me. And I hope that the remarks that I make tonight will play into that whole reasoning of why it is important to remember Armistice Day. In 1926, Congress approved a measure to mark Armistice Day, and the bill read as follows: the 11th of November, 1918, marked the cessation of the most destructive, sanguinary, and far-reaching war in human annals, and it is fitting that this day should be designed to perpetuate peace. Now, I am very much, I'm for honoring veterans. These are people that, regardless of how I may feel, the cause that they're serving, I very much believe that they're doing it because they think they're doing it for the best of their country, for the best of their family, and they're very much willing to make the ultimate sacrifice for that cause. And, you know, I went to the Veterans Day Parade today. When I told Gary I would come, I didn't realize that Fresno has the biggest Veteran Day parade in the country. I didn't realize how subversive this event was going to be that we're having here. It was too late once I figured that out. I was already locked in to come. I already had my train ticket from Oakland. So I'm still going to do it. I think we'll be okay. I've been to Fresno a few times before, and I've always really enjoyed it. And I saw at Veterans Day Parade today that it was important to the people who were there. It was important to the veterans who were there, observing it, older veterans, younger veterans from more recent wars. It's important to, I think, for us who desire peace, who don't think that you use war to get to peace. It's still important for us to meet people where they are and remember where they are and respect what's important for them. That said, it did make me think of something, though, because I was also listening to the words that were being said at the event. I was near City Hall, so I was where the stage was. I felt when those two fighter jets flew by really low, I felt my whole body vibrate. And then I heard that happens around here all the time. My goodness. But one gentleman in particular, and I don't remember his name, but he was one of the big dignitaries to speak at the event, said that that soldiers, that there has to be a price for peace. And what they meant by that, and it was very clear that price is war, and to go to war, and that the price for peace is war. Well, that's crazy. That was crazy talk. And that wasn't the veterans who were saying that. Now, some people obviously are going to agree with it. Many people are probably going to agree with it. But that was just, kind of astonishing to me. And I want to be a little careful, right? I want to be very respectful. I appreciated the event and the people that came out to it to mark it. But, there were a lot of kids there. And they see this. And they see this kind of lionizing and mythologizing the path of war. And it's also seductive. I get it. When I was a kid, I would never be, I'm a person with a disability. I would never get in the military. But I wanted to. I was playing guns and war and the whole thing. I mean, I get it. But this notion of that war is the price for peace, I think makes it even more important for us to remember what Armistice Day was originally about back in 1918 and afterwards when Congress declared Armistice Day in 1926. And then the other thing, and I am for honoring soldiers, and I go to sporting events, I hang out at things, you know. And whenever you go to a sporting event, there's always the honoring of the soldier, and that's fine. But I wish we also honored a lot of other people in our society that make sacrifices too. Teachers, nurses, the peacemakers. I can go on and on, the social workers. I'd like to go to a baseball game once and say, this is a night for social workers. I go to that game. You change the whole composition of the people that are in your stadium. But hey, here's the other thing I think is really important. In changing Armistice Day to Veterans Day, I think we took the emphasis away of what Congress called for in 1926 to perpetuate peace, and instead we put that emphasis on war, on the warrior. So I was saying, the mythologizing of it all. And the truth is, there are millions of people, there are millions of soldiers who died in World War I. But there are also millions of civilians who died in World War I too. World War, the reason it's a world war, the reason it was the Great War, was because it was total war. It encompassed everything about society at the time, and it was an entire societal effort, whether if you were for it or against it or whatever it may be. It affected everyone, especially if you were in Europe. So there's a lot to think about in thinking about Armistice Day and to think about the war that was supposed to end all wars. To reflect, for example, on the advancement in technology that on one hand, at the early 20th century, made life, in some ways, very much, just like today's technology does, made life very much easier in some aspects. But in other ways, it made mass murder possible. It made the maiming of people possible. And that's something we should remember and reflect upon when we talk about Armistice Day and remembering World War I. We should reflect that 4 empires fell after the end of World War I. What did that mean? We should think about what did it mean with the armistice, and actually happened before the armistice, but with World War I, what did it mean to carve up the Middle East according to British and French desire? What would that mean for future generations to come? What would that mean for us today? We should, in thinking about World War I, remember, in the remembrance of and the ability to do it, the 1915 genocide of Armenians. Historians called it a precursor to the Nazi Holocaust. Hitler said this, quote, "Who, after all, speaks today of the annihilation of the Armenians?" The Armenian genocide was a product of fervent nationalism that the war brought. I can think of no story that is as important today to remember as that one. Now, I wrote this before I got here because as soon as I got off the train yesterday in downtown, I saw the statue of David Sassoon, and I realized, okay, wait, these people here probably do remember the Armenian genocide quite well, right? A very vibrant, important, historic Armenian community here in Fresno. So perhaps reflecting on Veterans Day, the way that Veterans Day has now turned out to be, invites us to remember the soldier, the way of the soldier and war, but not, in fact, the entirety of its war itself. A war that would usher in a new and unprecedented global superpower, the United States of America, that would, 100 years later, have hundreds of military bases all over the world. Think about that in reflection to the war that was supposed to bring an end to all wars. Now, I do agree, I think it's pretty obvious by now, that we should rename it, or not rename it, return it to its original name, Armistice Day, for Veterans Day. But I don't know how much of a difference it would make, because I bet you if today it was called Armistice Day by everyone, I would be up here right now, and we'd be talking about how they're remembering the wrong things. And remembering it in the wrong way. But you know, I've said a few times, and people have heard this before, it's not new. It was the war to end all war. Well, there's another saying that maybe the armistice, which ended the fighting, was the peace that ended up ending all peace. I've spent a lot of time this past month, after I was asked to come speak to you all tonight, thinking about what am I going to say? What can I contribute to this really great gathering that I'm very happy to be at? I suspect many here are veterans, or have family members who are veterans. I know we all do. I'm a radio broadcaster. There is nothing that I can say tonight about war that probably everyone else here already knows, and for some will know more deeply than I ever will. But what I do on my radio program is we talk about history. And I hope, on a good day, we do it in a way that makes history relevant for ourselves today, for our political moment today, making history real and trying to understand how we got to this point. Now, there are always different views about history. It is not a science, you know. And there are different perspectives about history, and frequently they could both be right, and frequently they could both be wrong, and usually they're both kind of in the middle, right? But it's not an exact science. But that said, I think the telling of history is very political in itself, and important in the sense that history ends up setting the parameters of our political discussions today. What we talk about today, how we talk about today, always comes from our own collective understanding of history. And that's why history is important. History is also important because it's a struggle against forgetting. It's a struggle against forgetting the Armenian genocide, the forgetting also of a vibrant anti-war movement here in the United States that was repressed by the government by outlawing dissent with such things as the Sedition Act and the Espionage Act. I don't think that history necessarily repeats itself, but it does provide valuable lessons for us. People's psychology hasn't changed, right? We behave in similar ways or in interesting ways, the ways that people have behaved in the past. And it's good to know how people have behaved in the past and what pitfalls are out there so that we can learn from them. Now, the history I want to talk about tonight is what happens when liberalism fails. It happened in, and it really happened after World War I, and it's happening now again too. Now I'm going to be spanning through some history here, including a little bit of ancient history, so I'm sorry if you just want to start singing again. I won't mind. But I promise I'm going to bring it back to World War I and to today, because that's my ultimate focus here and what I've been thinking about. But I want to give a little bit of background about how I got to what I'm going to present today. World War I is an example of what happens when things fall apart in the liberal world. And when I say liberal, I don't necessarily mean left or progressive politics. I mean the liberalism that was formed out of the 17th and 18th century European Enlightenment with such philosophical thinkers as Voltaire and Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Diderot. Now, Voltaire is known for his commitment to reason, right, to using logic. And he and many others then, as well as today, believed that using reason and logic was superior over religious dogma, superstition, and appeals to old-time authority. And that reason will gradually improve life and improve civilization for everyone. That we don't have to have our way through brute force, but through arguments, through logic, through reason. I can either convince you to see things my way, or you can convince me to see things your way. But that's how we can end up getting to a better world. That with this approach, there will be a gradual improvement, gradual progress that would continue over time through this approach. This is what they meant by liberalism. And with this approach, that in this consistent progression, humans will actualize their highest aspirations. Now, I mentioned Diderot only because he's not as well remembered as Voltaire or Rousseau, but I'm going to be a bit gratuitous here because I like invoking his name whenever possible because he created the encyclopedia. And there was a lot of subversive stuff in the encyclopedia back in the 1800s, or the 1700s, forgive me. There were things like articles on science, articles on history, basically articles on how things work. That's some subversive stuff. It really was, because it undercut the power of kings, of the church, of the monarchies, of the power of the day. And facts are dangerous things. Facts were definitely dangerous things back in their day. And I think we're starting to learn that facts are dangerous things again today. It's funny, you can take steps backwards. History will prove this. It's not always this usual progression going forward. But again, this notion that reason and the liberty to use reason along with knowledge will gradually improve life, that's not bad. That's not a bad thing. I'm in. I like it. I'm for it. I don't know if there's actually a better way than that to do it. And in many ways, in the past 200 and 300 years, we could see many aspects of it, of how it has improved life. One example would be life expectancy, right? If we were doing this event 200-300 years ago, 90% of us, if we were the same age we are now, probably wouldn't be here, right? I, at most, would be, ready for my discount meal back in the old day. I probably wouldn't be here either. So in that respect, things have worked out pretty well. Now we have some problems. How are we going to deal with all this abundance and, using the earth and everything? But hey, right now, I'm glad we're all here. But whenever there is this abundance of confidence about things always getting better, beware. Thus warned another important philosopher of this enlightenment, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He was the antithesis to Voltaire, and they didn't like each other very much either. They were sort of intellectual enemies of the day, and I'm sure they would both despair today to know that their remains are very close to each other at the Paris Pantheon, probably for eternity. But I guess perhaps you're only as good as your best enemy, right? I call Rousseau an anti-Enlightenment thinker, but in fact he's considered one of the great Enlightenment philosophers. And what he did was he countered this narrative that gradual progress raises the bar for everyone, and he argues that it will be uneven and will leave many people behind. And in leaving people behind, that will create resentment. And in that resentment, you will get social unrest. So I think that's what happened, especially in the aftermath. Today is November the 12th, the day after the armistice. It was 100 years ago today. It was the day after the armistice. So I'm going to kind of focus on the day after the armistice and maybe what the end of World War I meant for many people. It was with the Enlightenment that we get the rebirth of democratic ideals. You know, the church, the kings relied on religion, divine right, military might, good old-fashioned appeals to the past to fortify their power. This orthodoxy is challenged by the Enlightenment, and not least, by another Enlightenment thinker by the name of John Locke. Now, John Locke came out with this idea that a legitimate government has the consent of its people, and that the consent of the people means that the people have chosen their government. And this was very popular at the time, and this is something that was very instrumental in the early republic. Now, Voltaire, he was opposed to democracy because he thought people were too selfish. They would only look after their own interests. He felt instead that the kings should have philosophers, a council of philosophers like him around to tell them how to do their thing. And he was in good company, actually. If we go a little bit farther back, or a lot farther back, 2,000 years ago, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle all thought the same thing. So I hope you'll entertain me here as I even go a little bit farther back into the classical world, because I think Aristotle is helpful as he came up with this formula that I think is instructive in understanding how governments change and the cycles of government. He says that there are 3 types of government when government works well: monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. And that there are 3 other types of government that are the opposite of these when governments fail, and that's tyranny, oligarchy, and mob rule. So let me put it this way to make it clear. This is one way the cycle works. And it's not 100%. And you can find many things like, well, wait a minute, I remember in 1789. But let me just say it anyways. So you begin with a monarch, or let's say a benevolent dictator, right? Somebody who's actually interested in the overall health of the society and is trying to do right. Well, eventually that's going to decay, either because this monarch or dictator has been in power for too long, or that person dies and then, you know, their relative takes over after that and they're not quite the same capable person as the previous person. Whatever it is, that monarchy will decay into tyranny. And then tyranny becomes so unbearable that it's overthrown by the next most powerful group in society, the aristocrats. Now, the original word, if you go back to ancient Greek for aristocrat, is the best, the most capable, the most qualified. That's what the word originally meant, and that's how Aristotle meant it at the time, right? These are the most qualified people. Now, I have a friend who is a professor of ancient Rome, and I was talking this through with him, and he told me, well, Mitch, be careful. Aristocrats have always thought they're the best. Right, so let's just keep that in mind. But eventually, just like the monarchy, the aristocracy, that form of government will also decay and turn into oligarchy. And that oligarchy is ruled by the few for the few, is how that decays. And now you have oligarchy. We even said that we have an oligarchic system here. But that becomes so unbearable as well that then the people rise up and overthrow it, and now the people rule, and that they rule through democracy. And now you have democracy and everything's looking good. Except that decays too once it turns into mob rule, especially pure democracy, the way they used to have in ancient Athens, where everyone voted on everything, and as long as you had a majority, you got your way, and what you do with that majority is, oftentimes you end up trampling the rights of the minority, and it just turns into mob rule until it eventually turns into chaos. And as it turns into chaos, it decays into chaos, and they had a word for this, ochlocracy. It's when democracies turn into chaos, ochlocracy. And when that happens, people are so tired of it that the field is ripe for the return of a dictator, a strong-armed dictator, who is going to return and restore order and normalcy. And the cycle once again begins anew. So the challenge of John Locke, who is talking about democracy, and others was, how do you stop democracy from devolving into an ochlocracy, into chaos? We like government of the people, but how do you keep it stable? Well, in steps another Enlightenment philosopher, and then I'll be done after these philosophers after this, that the American framers relied very heavily on, and that's Montesquieu, or the Baron of Montesquieu, as the French would like to say. Montesquieu, in a seminal work called The Spirit of Laws, he studied ancient democracies and ancient republics, and he sought out how can we keep these republics, these democracies, from devolving into chaos. So he came up, and this is where we get it, with a system of checks and balances, so that the one institution or one part of government or one person or even a small group of people cannot have a monopoly on power again. That there would be separate but equal governing bodies that would serve as a check on one another. This is what the American democratic system is a product of. The framers created a system of three branches of government. We have the executive with the president, the judiciary with the Supreme Court and the federal court system, and we also have the legislature. You know, the executive enforces the law, the Congress makes the law, and the Supreme Court tells you what the law is. But something else that they did during this period of time is they made sure to try to separate the seat of government as far away from the people as possible. They thought, and they would say, to keep the mob out, right? But of course, keeping the mob out kind of means keeping the people out too. And that's very much what they did. We basically have a system in which we elect aristocrats or elites to make democratic choices for us. It's not pure democracy. There has been pure democracy in the past. Ancient Athens would be one example. 2,000 years ago, people voted on most things. And I think we want pure democracy. And here we have referendums and propositions in California. You can argue whether or not those are good things or not good things. But let me just say one thing about this idea of pure democracy. It was through pure democracy, and it was through the democratic process that they, in ancient Athens, assassinated Socrates for corrupting the youth. They voted on that. There was a trial and it was voted on. Ancient Greeks also constantly voted for war. They constantly voted for empire. For about 200 years they did so, until the warring state devoured itself and it was put to an end by Alexander the Great. So the American framers created a pretty stable system, which we've had now for some 200 years. It has survived countless wars, including civil war, presidential assassinations, economic depressions, and the enfranchisement of former slaves into the system, the enfranchisement of immigrants into the system, the enfranchisement of women into the system. I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm not saying that's our struggle today, right? Is how do we get further involvement, further enfranchisement. But this system that was set up has survived the changes in society that we've seen over 200 years, and that's pretty good. I mean, the American Constitution is really probably the ultimate achievement of the Enlightenment. But why I talk about all this, and you might be like, I thought this was about World War I, Mitch. I'm getting there. And the reason why I bring this all up is because they figured out how to keep democracy, perhaps, from devolving into chaos. But what they had not done was figure out how to save democracy from when liberalism fails and people are left behind. This is exactly what Rousseau was warning about. It happened in Germany after World War I, when you had the formation of the Weimar Republic. It was a very liberal step. It failed, and we ended up getting fascism out of that. In understanding World War I think it's also important to understand capitalism, because capitalism is also a product of the Enlightenment. It's that era of philosophers that we get Adam Smith considered the intellectual founder of capitalism. And that's that people can produce and buy freely without interference. They will use reason to make the best decisions for them, and that this will inevitably create a market where production meets demand. It's the invisible hand of the market. Before World War I, the European states had a very laissez-faire approach to economics, and economic integration between the countries had advanced so much that it was said at the time that these countries would never go to war with each other. We hear that today, especially with the United States and China, that our economies are so intertwined that we would never go to war with each other. Well, that's what they said about the European countries in Europe, or the European, of course they're in Europe. That's what they said about the European countries just before 1914 and the war began. Now there's this popular view that World War I began by a 19-year-old anarchist by the name of Gavrilo Princip, who assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who was in line to become the next emperor of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Well, after the assassination, the Austro-Hungarian Empire invaded Serbia, because the assassination happened in Sarajevo, invaded Serbia, and then, as it's invading Serbia, Russia, as it will historically does, gets into the fight and supports Serbia. Now, Russia itself, just like the Austro-Hungarian Empire, is an empire. Then the Germans joined the Austrian-Hungarian Empire by attacking Russia in the east, and Belgium in the west, because Germany had its own empire to grow. Well, an attack on Belgium got both France and Great Britain into the war because they had their own empires to protect. The Ottomans, another empire, sided with Germany, and next thing you know, the Great War was on. It was a war between empires, and the ultimate victor of the war, the United States, would go on to form a new kind of empire that was very much fit for the 20th century. Now that narrative is grossly simplistic, but I think mostly true. All these nations were industrial powerhouses, some stronger than others, jockeying for colonial possessions, trading routes, and markets. The dam, or the so-called, what they like to call, the concert of Europe, was going to break, regardless of what a 19-year-old anarchist did. They like to say this was a war of sleepwalkers. The country sleptwalk into this war. But I don't think so. I don't think it was an accident. You don't have a world war accidentally. It was a logical conclusion of the growth of these empires that was spurred on by industrialization. Now, for most of the 4+ years that the United States military of the war, the 4 years of the war, the United States military stayed out of it until 1917. But not our bankers, not our capitalists. We were selling guns and weapons like hotcakes to countries like France and Great Britain, and it was our own financial institutions that were providing those countries the credit to buy the guns. War is big business. It was then and it was now. The American economy, when 1914, up into the time that it got into the war, was booming, in large part because of the war. But after the Bolshevik Revolution, Russia pulled out of the First War. And for a moment, it looked like that Germany and Austro-Hungary and the others had the upper hand. And the investments from the U.S. bankers looked like that was in a lot of trouble. So that's when we got involved. I'm not arguing that's the only reason, but I am arguing that's a major reason. Things are always more complicated. You can never just look at one thing and say, that's it. It's usually a whole concurrence of events that are occurring. But this is a very important one to understand. This is really one of the first major capitalist war in an age and technological advancement, industrialization. And this meant that the development of new weapons created the capacity for mass murder. More than 17 million people would die from machine guns, poison gas, bombs falling from the air from airplanes, This is a crazy, crazy, crazy world. And it's also a moment in time that with or without the war also creates a sense of alienation that, again, the philosopher Rousseau warned about. Let's think about this era for a moment, 100 years ago, right? This is the era when we're finally getting electricity for the masses, right? You think the internet changed things. You should try going from a life without electricity to a life with electricity. The era of trains, automobiles, and planes. You know, I was born in 1972, and things are definitely different now than they were when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s. And I sometimes feel overwhelmed by all the technological things that are happening in the world today and how I function in that world. And I grew up with a computer, with like an Apple II and a Commodore, you know? But I never grew up with a computer in my toaster. Like, I'm talking to my appliances now. My great-grandmother talked to her appliances too, but mine talk back. And do what I say. Right? I mean, it's crazy. Well, this is what people are dealing with 100 years ago too, right? Up to and after the World War. And we laugh about it, but it also creates alienation because it's changing the economy. It's very much changing the economy today. It was very much changing the economy 100 years ago. People who whole lives were spent on farms were now, if they were lucky at the very best, was looking at a future in a factory or wondering what their future was going to be at all. Very much we're experiencing this today in a different way with the technological revolution. I mean, how many people even own radios anymore? I'm worried myself, you know. It's what the Austrian economist Joseph Schumpeter would call creative destruction. And what that means is that through development, through technological development, you are going to change society in which it's going to destroy the old world, destroy the old way of how things were done. And in doing that, there's going to be losers. There's going to be a lot of losers. And again, that's what creates alienation and resentment that Jean-Jacques Rousseau warned of in a liberal society. So this is for all veterans. This is what veterans are coming home from the First World War. Many of them are, missing limbs, disfigured. But this life is even compounded for veterans of Germany or Italy who lost the war. This is where resentment grew to its most dangerous level. The soldiers who fought for the losing side saw their defeat as a disgrace. And they blamed the communists, they blamed the socialists, they blamed the international bankers, and they blamed the Jews for bringing the war to an end. They said that they were stabbed in the back. They called those who tried to bring the war to an end the November criminals. This is what Benito Mussolini thought, who was the originator of fascism. This is what Hitler thought. Both of these figures are World War I veterans. Now, it's hard to find any sense of sympathy with these notorious figures, but there were many World War I veterans who felt that Mussolini and Hitler, that they were speaking to them, who felt like their sacrifices went for nothing. And Mussolini and Hitler were able to direct that resentment into a dangerous force whose remnants, I argue, still are with us today. The end of World War I did not lead to the return of normalcy for even the winners, never mind the losers. And what came 100 years ago today, November 12th, 1918, for a lot of these people, was just more chaos. I like to tell the story of Munich, Germany. This is the southern part of Germany in what was the Kingdom of Bavaria, still considered the Bavarian part. It's where the Nazis come from. And Munich, just like all over Europe, was having major demonstrations trying to get the war to end. So you had people who did not want the war to end, especially a lot of veterans, but there were plenty of people around Europe who were more than ready to have the war end, and they're having these mass demonstrations, and they had them in Munich. And then the war ends, and the Bavarian kingdom collapses, and there's a vacuum in power. And it's immediately filled, not by the Nazis, but by democratic socialists. It was kind of crazy. They just, and it was a peaceful revolution. What happened was the Bavarian kingdom collapsed, and there was like no one in the parliament. So they just went in and said, we're taking over now. It's like if we were in Washington, D.C., and the White House was just open and no one was in there. Like, hey, we're running the show. And it was led by a man by the name of Kurt Eisner, who I think is a very historic figure that I never heard about before I actually went to Munich to study all this history. And under Kurt Eisner, this new republic, they created an 8-hour workday. And they all did it. It wasn't very long-lived, unfortunately. But within just a few weeks, they created an 8-hour workday, women's suffrage, and other things that we would consider liberal progress. But the economy was terrible, as you would think, after losing a war, and they didn't quite have the means to be able to fulfill the basic needs of society. So there was an election. And in this election, the Democratic Socialists lost terribly. They lost the election. And in the very next day, it was February 19, 1919, Kurt Eisner goes in to hand in his resignation, accepting his party's defeat. And as he's doing that, with his resignation letter in his hand, as he's climbing the stairs of the Bavarian parliament, he's assassinated by a right-wing activist. So what happens? More chaos. And then suddenly, there's another revolution in Munich. And another group takes over. Not the Nazis, but the communists. This is one of the craziest stories I've ever heard. It went further left, right? And the communists took over, and they created a Soviet republic. But, like the left usually does, there's another group of communists that looked at that group and said, they're not communist enough, we're the real communists, and they overthrew them. This all happens in 2 months. And in a matter of just a few weeks, you have a second Soviet republic. Well, not too much longer after that, there was the rise of right-wing paramilitary groups, and they murdered the communists. And this is the beginning of the era of the Nazis. This is what the Nazis come out of. It's a development, it's a few years, but they take over Munich. They always considered Munich to be their spiritual headquarters, their spiritual homeland in Bavaria, even though they go to Berlin, and that's what they eventually do. They eventually take over the entire country, and in that, start another war for those veterans like Hitler and Mussolini, who thought the first war should have never really ended. You know, I've thought a lot about why would you assassinate Kurt Eisner as he's going in to hand in his resignation? Why doing that? He's resigning, he's quitting, he lost. Well, I don't know for sure. And you know, it only takes one madman with a gun to change the course of history. We see all these mass shootings now, almost becoming normal today. But let me tell you, something like this can change history in a moment and can change things quickly. But I think it was more than that, though, why they assassinated Kurt Eisner. Because I think the most profound thing you can do to to ensure a stability in a democracy or in a republic is the peaceful transfer of power from one group to another group. That's how you end up having your solid foundation. That's when you know people from different perspectives are recognizing this system that you had. And I think the fascists looked at that as dangerous and that they could never flourish within a republic or a democracy. And so the assassination was purposefully to drive it back into chaos. But the fascists were wrong on that because they tried to have a military-style revolution, and they were beat. That's why Hitler went to jail, where he wrote Mein Kampf, because he was arrested after they failed. And in fact, when Hitler got back out, he used the democratic system. And they learned that we can use democracy to get into power. And he did. And he got into the highest level of power. And that's where he killed the democracy. That's where he killed the Weimar Republic. That's how it was done there. When I think of this story, I also like to think, and I think of another, I want to talk about quickly here, a World War I veteran, also from Germany. Do people know who Martin Niemöller was? Some do, not everybody. Martin Niemöller was the man who came up with this iconic saying, "First they came for the communists, and I did not speak up. Then they came for the socialists, and I did not speak up. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak up. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak up. And then when they came for me, there was no one else to speak for me." That's Martin Niemöller. He was a priest that came up with that iconic saying. He was also a U-boat operator in World War I, and he was one of many veterans after the war who thought he was stabbed in the back. He fought alongside and with these right-wing paramilitary groups in the street against the left. He opposed the Weimar Republic, and he was a supporter of the Nazis. He supported Hitler's move to end the Republic in 1933, but he was also a very religious man who was steeped in the tradition of Martin Luther and the Reformation. And his relationship to the Nazi Party fell apart once the Nazis started meddling in church affairs and started trying to Aryanize the church itself. I mean, Martin Luther, you think of the Reformation, what he did was he set his own church free from the dogmas of the power of the day, which was the Catholic Church, because he felt people should be able to read the Bible for themselves and have their own personal relationship to God. The Nazis started interfering with religious doctrine to fit its own worldview, and this was a deal breaker for Martin Niemöller. So he opposed the Nazis, and so doing so, he wound up in a concentration camp. He'd survived the camp after it was liberated, and that's when he came up with those iconic words. It's a true story. Martin Niemöller lived a long life, well into his 90s. And that story I just said was basically the first half of his life. His second half of his life, he would become an anti-war crusader to fight against war. And also anti-nuclear war crusader as well, very much steeped in that. So the failure of liberalism is visible in many ways, including today. After the onset of the 2008 recession, we all saw clearly the great wealth that liberalism created, but only a few people had it. All of this breeds resentment. The elimination of manufacturing jobs, the elimination of jobs that are being shipped to other countries, the elimination of jobs that are going to other countries. the feeling of alienation. What are you going to do in your life? This all breeds resentment, and this resentment can be manipulated in many ways. It can spur right-wing authoritarian and fascist movements, but it can also spur left-wing movements, and usually it does both. It's just the right wing seems to be able to fight in the streets with guns a little bit better than we can. But not the Bolsheviks. You know, during the Great Depression, and remember, the Great Depression is after World War I. Now, it's more than a decade after, but it's in this period. We saw fascist movements here in America, led by the likes of Henry Ford, who pushed the conspiracy theory that the Jews were behind everything and running the world, and Charles Lindbergh and the America First movement. Think of Make America Great Again. Well, they were saying this in the 1930s too, America First movement. But on the other hand, we saw something else happen during this period of time in the 1930s. And that's the transformation of the U.S. government during the presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, in which the government took an active role in trying to improve the quality of life for most people with the creation of such things as Social Security, the ability to unionize and do collective bargaining with employers, and infrastructure programs. I think that there is a strong argument that the New Deal kept American fascists at the margins of American society in the 1930s, while fascism was raging throughout Europe. Now, it wasn't FDR who did this all from his own initiative. He was pushed. He was pushed by labor unions. He was pushed by communist socialists. These people were vibrant during this period of time, who also felt resentment. Socialists, communists, they felt resentment too about what was going on, but they weren't about scapegoating immigrants and others. That's the difference. Fascists use resentment to say it's us against them. We say, there's plenty for everyone. Chill out. You know who really pushed FDR? Veterans from World War I. People know about the bonus army? Does anybody not know about the bonus army? Okay, good, just checking. These were veterans from the Great War who were suffering in the Depression. They were promised a bonus for their service in war, but they weren't going to get it until they were older. But they needed it now. This is the Great Depression. So veterans from all over the country descended to Washington, D.C., and they erected tent cities all across the Washington Mall. I learned about this story during the Occupy movement. I realized, oh, this isn't new. This has happened before. Well, they do this towards the end of the Herbert Hoover administration, which basically declared war against them. Hoover ordered the army that was led by Douglas MacArthur to attack these World War I veterans who have created these tent cities in Washington, D.C. They burned them down and attacked them. This was remarkable. Our own military, the army, we don't think about the army, well, it's pretty scary to know that they're at the border now. But imagine the army being used to attack our own veterans. That's crazy. It was a tragedy. But then FDR comes. This is at the very end of the Hoover administration. FDR comes into office, and that first month that FDR is in office, there's a second bonus army that comes to Washington, D.C. And you know how FDR and Eleanor Roosevelt greeted them? With coffee and with jobs. These were some of the first employees of the Civilian Conservation Corps. They saw what was going on in Europe, and they were like, we got to do something about this. Montesquieu, who I mentioned earlier, checks and balances, figured out how do you keep democracy from devouring itself, from eating itself alive, from devolving into chaos. I like to think these folks, FDR and others, FDR wasn't alone, John Maynard Keynes, Francis Perkins, I think they figured out, what do you do when liberalism fails, when too many people are left behind, and it's dangerous. You know, these veterans from the First World War, the first bonus army that was attacked by its own government, you don't think they were ripe for some fascist demagogue like Father Charles Coughlin, the radio broadcaster? So on this Armistice Day, it's important to remember the entirety of war. And that can never exclude the veteran. The veteran has always played an outsized role in public affairs, for better or for worse. Julius Caesar used the discontent of Roman soldiers who were destitute after serving in imperial wars around the world in order to get absolute power. 2,000 years later, Mussolini would rise to the power on the backs of destitute veterans. Today in America, there are thousands of veterans from Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan living in the streets, and many more doing everything they can to keep themselves from getting to that point. In the 2016 election, Donald Trump's largest portion of support came from whites who have connection to the military. Donald Trump is a demagogue who is now in the most powerful position in all the world. We have to take this very seriously. I don't think we are a fascist country. We have our shortcomings, but not that. Not yet. But I do fear we're flirting with it. I think we need to keep in mind how someone like FDR and others greeted those World War veterans when they came back with coffee and jobs. Something very important happened in the 1960s during the Vietnam War, and that was the Vietnam War veterans getting into the fight for peace and forming the Vietnam Veterans Against the War. Then in 1985, other veterans formed Veterans for Peace and got in the fight for peace. My friends, the Raging Grannies and the peace groups, the Peace Fresno, and I can't see the sign over there, but the sign right over there too. My friends, you are all doing the work to counter the demagoguery of Donald Trump and Sean Hannity, and showing especially veterans, and I know it's not easy, I was at that Veterans Parade earlier today, but you're showing them there's another approach to the world rather than hate, but through peace. And I admire you all that are doing that deeply. You're on the front lines of fighting fascism, hatred, and war, and today I can't tell you how honored I am to be able to mark the 100th anniversary of Armistice Day with you, and for you all helping me to see how important it is that we do call it what it is, Armistice Day. Thank you.